Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the MEF Economic Briefing. My name is Mike Blakely, and I am the CEO of the MEF Economic Forum. We're a nonprofit organization providing research and advisory on the Marin County Bay Area economy. You can find out more about our work by visiting our website at marineconomicforum.org. Welcome to this morning's briefing. Today is September 1st. Kids are back in school and college football season kicks off this weekend. But that's about the only thing that's certain right now. The last few weeks, our global economy, national, even local economy has been rife with uncertainty, with all kinds of actions happening, and we're here this morning to tell you about that. Joining me, as usual, is MEF Chief Economist, Dr. Rob Eiler. Rob is going to take us through the data and tell us as best he can what's going on out there. And then at the end of the program, I'll come back and talk about a newer activity that the MEF Economic Forum is involved in that we're really excited about and excited to share with all of you. So thank you again for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Rob.
Thanks, Mike. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Thanks so much. Sorry for my voice, folks. I had a little throat problem here the last couple of days, but we'll get through it. Thank you again for making the time today. So let's start by looking at the evolution of jobs at the national level. So the total number of people employed in January 2020 was reached again in July 2022 by the estimates of the Bureau of Labor Statistics for the United States overall. California and Marin County have not quite gotten back to the January 2020 level of seasonally adjusted employment for all employment in the area, whether it be the state or the county. But the more intriguing part is the evolution of jobs and kind of where we've been. So the initial 2 months, April and May 2020, saw some severe job cuts across almost every single industry in the sense of how relative you think severe is. If you look at the far right-hand side, which we'll come back and talk about in just a second, you can see accommodation in food services and drinking places. Basically, when you squish those together, you get leisure and hospitality as an industry. You can see those are way down in the first 2 months. But by the end of 2020, things had climbed back up. And by the end of 2021, we actually not only saw a really good recovery, but we saw some industries actually see positive growth from where they were pre-pandemic. So these data are going to be compared in the month you see to January 2020, thinking of that as a pre-pandemic benchmark. And then this is May, June, and July 2022. So this is where we're at in the American economy. And if you look again to the far right, while you see a lot of, as you move from left to right, you see a lot of industries that have fully recovered, but accommodation is still down about 19% across the country. Now, it doesn't mean people haven't started traveling again. It doesn't mean that hotel occupancy is not up. What it means is the business model of doing business where people stay overnight is changing and has not quite come back yet. And the big question is whether or not it will come back. And this is true in a couple other industries. We'll talk about that when we talk about Marin County. But this is where we're watching pretty closely as economists, because for the most part, we're seeing generally recovery otherwise across industries. But that accommodation one is tough because that's where you see a lot of our low and middle wage workers, especially younger workers, transition from not working into the workforce. And if those jobs don't come back, that's a fifth of those jobs that basically now have been eliminated structurally from the economy. The big question is inflation for most people, even though, as I'll talk about at the end, the bigger question is actually how our labor markets are reacting to that. But these are the latest data through July. So these data came out about 6-7 days ago. And this is what the Federal Reserve is looking at when it makes interest rate decisions. This is called core, meaning without food and energy inside the shopping basket for people every month they buy stuff. Personal consumption expenditures, that's the shopping basket of what we buy at home. And the evolution of prices looking back 1 year. So where it says July 4.6%, that means that the price of the shopping cart that you buy every month, the average American, without food and energy services or goods inside that shopping cart, increased by 4.6%. Now, we usually pull food and energy prices out when we think about pricing because we're concerned that the volatility in food and energy prices will give a false signal as to the trend of prices and ultimately of inflation. But that 4.6% inflation is down from recent heights and is basically on the path, which is this shaded area through those red dots that the Federal Reserve wants to see. So why have we been so aggressive in terms of seeing central bank policy in the United States trying to lift interest rates up quickly? It's because it's trying to turn that corner with this price index and force it as best it can through those red dots. We will see how it goes. But things to watch is actually the optics. Is is this actually translating to what we see at the grocery store, what we see at the gas pump, and are people feeling like inflation is actually subsiding? Because one of the biggest issues for central banking is actually not the current inflation rate, but how people are forming expectations about the future inflation rates and how their behavior is changing because of those changing expectations. So at the end of the day, when you hear about interest rates rising very quickly, it's because the Federal Reserve is trying to actually turn expectations, which should lead to behavior change and turn this price index down as a signal that that's working. But that's the key. We need to see those optics, and people need to feel like those changes are occurring. In terms of overall interest rates, we've seen some wild movement in interest rates over the last 4 or 5 months. The real big deal is whether or not the yield curve, or the difference between what lenders generate when they lend money and what it costs them to generate funds for lending, has flattened. So one of the biggest issues for central banking now, and for the Federal Reserve to think about, because it actually is a worldwide issue for central banks, is how aggressive should you be in fighting inflation or turning expectations without upsetting the way that banks lend money, and ultimately that businesses find growth capital through borrowing. So we're watching that closely to see how rapid those short-term rates go up and upend the normal credit provision model. We're also watching housing prices and local employment levels. So I'll talk a little bit more about housing prices in a minute, but one of the biggest issues in terms of declaring whether or not recession has happened, the next slide will talk more about this, is what's going to happen on our labor markets. So the biggest issue with inflation fighting and ultimately trying to turn the ship around, as you can see with this blue line, is whether or not it's supply or demand that's causing that increase in the prices. We think, generally speaking, it's demand only. It's acting like that, but we know there's a supply issue there. The supposition has been continuously that the supply side of the economy will naturally clean itself up through profit incentives. If somebody's making a lot of money in the supply chain, why don't I start a business and help relieve some of the pressure that's creating higher prices and generate some of that profit for myself? That's a classic way we think about how economics works. Well, by the nature of how our labor markets have been working, it's been tough for businesses to just snap a finger and do that where they see profits. We just don't have the available workers, and it has been tough to promise the ability to deliver goods to market over the last 24 months, simply because we just don't know if the supply chains are going to be stable. These are the latest data out of the Federal Reserve in terms of their forecast, looking forward the next few quarters and the next few years. What I want to do is just walk you through this quickly and get to the annual data, which are the most important. They're in 3 couplets: real GDP, last quarter's forecast in the first column, and the new forecast in the second column. And I'm now going to shade that area. These data are just from about 2 weeks ago. The next 2 are the unemployment rate, previous quarter, and the new or the current quarter's forecast. And then the data we basically just saw, those red dots sort of correspond to the beginning of this forecast. The red dots more specifically are the annualized forecasts, as we'll see in a second. But notice how some of these things have changed from just the last couple of quarters. So if you look previous quarter on GDP, which is real income growth or income growth after inflation, full downgrade across all those quarters. And this is going to be true more or less for the next couple of years, as we'll see in a second. Unemployment rate has actually picked up a little bit over the next couple of quarters. We're expecting more people to come on to the labor force and not necessarily be picked up right away by employers, believe it or not. That will pick up the unemployment rate a little bit, but still not significantly, in the sense it's not shooting back up to 5 or 6%. The inflation rate we're assuming is going to slowly downturn, but it's real slow, still about 2.8, 2.6% in the middle of next year. On an annualized basis, you can see same deal. For this year, downgrade from 2.5% growth, which is so basically pre-pandemic growth for the American economy, down to 1.6%. So that's really kind of almost like a stagnant economy now. Once you slip under 2% growth per annum, your economy is really kind of a slow mover. And that's also looking true more for 2023. So when you hear a discussion about recession and whether or not we're on the precipice of recession, part of the story is that when growth after inflation, or our ability to produce goods and services and the value of those goods and services after we take inflation into account slows down and gets closer to 0, we believe that then businesses are going to start thinking about, well, should we hire or not anymore? And that's why you're sort of seeing that in unemployment rate kick up a little bit with a slowing economy. Do I really need to continue hiring or use those job openings and actually fill them? Or should I start removing job openings from the market? The inflation rate, those are basically corresponding to the red dots, specifically we just saw in the last graph. So slow decline down to 2024, but still elevated from pre-pandemic conditions by quite a bit. through at least 2024. And that seems to be the consensus view, with unemployment still staying relatively low, but creeping up a little bit from the previous quarter's forecast. So when you take all this into account, the two main things are that, one, we're still growing as an economy. You can see in the blue, it says what the first two quarters of 2022 were. They were both negative, and that started a lot of recession talk. But there's no recession yet baked into these data, in the sense that the unemployment rate will not raise up enough to actually declare a recession is going to happen. And the growth rate, if it actually stays positive, will not provide the conditions under which we would normally declare a recession either. So the key, though, is that don't get too caught up on the declaration of it. You got to look on the street and say, are people acting like it's recession or not? Are people changing the way they're consuming? Are businesses changing the way they're hiring and buying goods and buying inputs? If that's happening, it's going to feel very recession-like, whether or not we declare one. It's sort of this black box-ish way that we see at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Okay, so this is the evolution of jobs in Marin County since the beginning of the with our pre-pandemic benchmark of January 2020. Once again, just like we saw in the data above for the American economy, but this one focuses only on the people that live in Marin County. So the number of people that are working that live in Marin County is still 94.8% of the January 2020 number, seasonally adjusted. Now, what that suggests is that we've had people that have left the labor force, and thus we have a little bit lower number. And you can see that while that number fell sharply initially, we crept back up. It's been a very slow mover back up. People that live in Marin County may not be counted in the official data because they're self-employed. So that's another caveat to seeing these data or hearing the monthly labor market data about Marin County. It does not count the self-employed. So we're watching this closely, just because from a trend standpoint, we want that to continue to creep up toward that red dotted line and basically recover what was lost. But Marin County may be a little bit more anomalous than other counties in California, especially, relatively medium-sized ones, in that there's a lot of people self-employed or people that are able to leave the labor force and maybe not come back immediately. This is California. So the state overall kind of followed a similar pattern, not as sharp a cut, but also kind of a slow and steady move up, and is just about to cross that threshold. So while the American economy has moved a little bit more quickly, California is now catching up. Here's the same data. I'm going to move us through to the latest data, July 2022. You're going to see a very similar pattern to what we saw in the American economy for Marin County here in a second. You can see on the far right-hand side, jobs in leisure and hospitality, sharp cut the first couple months after COVID really seized up our economy based on our social choices. And up the ladder, we started to move in 2020, for the rest of 2020 into 2021. And then here we are now in 2022. Now, again, look at the far right-hand side. Education, leisure and hospitality, other services. Other services is this squished together of hair salons, nail salons, auto shops, fitness centers, a bunch of things we can't categorize very well, including nonprofits that aren't related to healthcare. All those are still down 10% in Marin County. Transportation's up, construction's up, but other than that, everything's still down from pre-pandemic conditions. So the thing about these numbers is that, one, it suggests that what's happening in Marin County is not as productive as it was pre-pandemic, but it could be primarily a function of the lack of worker availability in Marin County to fulfill job openings and actually creep all these numbers back up. One thing we're concerned very largely about is that we don't want to see this become a structural change. We do not want these relatively high percentage changes now to be a brand new business model. That means we're never going to get back in some of these industries to pre-pandemic conditions. That's a big hurt on our workforce development efforts. And so we'll see how that goes. But that's why we watch these data every month, is because we're concerned about those three key categories: education, health services, leisure and hospitality, and other services. Education, for example, is really driven by what's happening in terms of the number of teachers that we have, and also to a certain extent specific nonprofit healthcare that hasn't quite come back yet. If we look across California at our metropolitan statistical areas, you can see Marin is at the very bottom in terms of growth with respect to that pre-pandemic benchmark, still 8.2% below on average. It's just not quite climbing up as other ones are. Again, think that does not count self-employed. California average is negative 0.2, but you'll notice the names of the metro areas that are below California and the ones that are above California. So if you look at the very top, we're talking about basically rural California short of Sacramento, And a lot of those places did not have the same social shutdowns we had in Marin County when COVID-19 began. But we're watching closely to see how these data evolve. And again, it's tricky because in some counties, the self-employed and the number of people that are maybe able to sustain themselves outside the labor force otherwise is different. And COVID-19 has really shifted the way we see that. But if you look here, the labor force has not recovered, and that's a critical factor. So it's possible that a lot of this is driven by a lack of availability of workers. And we're concerned that we're going to see unemployment rise, and we should expect that to happen in 2023, even though we saw in the data above, it should not surge up. But that mix of supply and demand characteristics that's keeping rehiring from happening, again, the critical factor is whether or not that leads to structural change. We've seen more building in Marin County, which is good. So this is the evolution on an annualized basis in the number of permitted new housing units in 1990, and you can see the shaded areas are the recession since 1990. It really gives you a sense of how we've seen ups and downs in building. So we had, building was really trucking along through the 90s, which is classic, and we all knew that story, and then really took a dive as we went into the Great Recession. Kind of kicked back up again, primarily multifamily in the early 2010s, and then has been sort of, has been relatively lower levels for the last 4 or 5 years, but has started to kick back up. So low interest rates in 2020 and 2021 provided developers with incentive, I think pushed some projects through the pipeline. We also have the RHNA numbers, those regional housing needs assessment numbers, where we know there's some pressure to build more housing. The critical factor here is while we see this, there's 2 issues. One is this should keep construction and its related industries somewhat employed if these data continue to rise. That's good for our construction businesses and the economic impacts from that increase. The second is the mix of housing. What's this leave Marin County with? Not now, but 5 years from now in terms of housing mix with respect to how that connects to both economic development and workforce development. This is the latest housing market forecast. And Mike and I have actually tried not to talk too much about housing the last 20 months or so, because it seems like, okay, so what, right? We know housing prices are high. The reason I'm showing this is because these data are now suddenly showing negative growth over the next year. So we over the last basically 48 months, we have not had a negative forecast for any place in California with respect to changing median housing prices looking out 1 year. That has started to creep in, and you can see Marin County's current forecast is negative 1.2 for the next 12 months. We've seen such a surge in housing prices. It'll be intriguing to watch, and why I'm showing this is because we just looked at building permits and thinking about, okay, well, we're building more housing. Will a change in housing prices shift developer incentives? Will it shift buyer incentives? And will we see more consternation around how housing is evolving in Marin County? And this is true for most of the Bay Area. As you can see, a lot of those places on the far right-hand side that have negative forecasts are primarily Bay Area counties. What's that mean in terms of how we're reacting to the economy overall? A lot of us have this sort of shadow effect of the Great Recession, remembering what happened between 2006 and 2009. Will a very small downturn in housing prices start to change regional behavior around building homes, buying homes, and will that start to have sort of implicit economic impacts in the way we're spending otherwise and trying to move forward as an economy? So watch that stuff. You're going to hear a lot of things about what's going on in housing prices. There's going to be a lot of people out there talking about a sharp downturn. There's no reason to think we're going to repeat 2006 to 2009 anytime soon, but these negative numbers have crept back into the forecast for the first time in a long time. So for Marin County, the inflation issues continue, and we know Marin County probably has a little higher cost of living. So the wage pressures on businesses and the surge costs for labor continue. Are more workers coming onto the market, and will that help relieve pressures? We will see if Marin County employers have actually changed their business model or not. Those higher interest rates lead to a wild difference in some of the outlooks that are out there. In some cases, there are agencies, so the Atlanta Federal Reserve, one branch of the Federal Reserve, and Fannie Mae, and a couple other banking economists out there are saying recession is coming, primarily because those rates are rising faster than they should be on the short end and flattening out that yield curve that leads to more credit or not, depending on how flat or steep it may be. Watch construction as a way of trying to figure out whether or not higher rates are really playing out in terms of the slowdown in the economy. But we're still watching commercial real estate as well. And so next time we see you, we're going to talk a little bit more about commercial real estate and its evolution. That's been a big concern overall, and whether or not that part of our construction, tenant improvement, and really just real estate economy is looking at kind of a wobbly, maybe not just 1 year, but maybe another 2 or 3 years. Tourism had a great year in Marin County. The Marin County Visitors Bureau has done a great job in just driving people toward Marin County. And 2023 will likely be the year that we see spending come back across California to pre-pandemic levels. But the employment in those areas is still below. We do not expect it to come back maybe to 2024 or 2025. We're going to see how many adjustments are made. What we think going forward is that there'll be an energy race, and you should be a little bit skeptical about how much the Inflation Reduction Act will actually reduce inflation pressure based on more tax revenue the government's spending. But the key there is we're actually making investments in energy infrastructure. The cool thing about that, especially what Mike's now going to talk to you about in terms of the Economic Vitality Strategic Plan, is that Marin County may be very well poised to take advantage of entrepreneurship as we get closer and closer to more energy solutions in our economy. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Mike.
Thanks so much, Rob. As usual, just a ton of stuff to dig through. We did have one question, and then I wanted to ask a couple things about what you presented. We had a question from Kevin Carroll, who talked about cities in Marin are considering rent control. And you want to talk a little bit about what the impacts of that could be?
Classic question. Thank you for that question. So rent control certainly helps the renter in the sense it allows, or it puts a stop on what might be seen as market price increases in rent. It can also lead to a less investment in those rental properties. And that's sort of the game that gets played between landlords and renters when rent control comes on the docket in terms of a public policy issue. So watch for those kind of arguments. Generally speaking, economists do not like rent control because it can lead to things, it can lead to decision-making that really is not market driven, but it certainly can help people stay in their apartment more for a longer period of time. The one thing to watch for is having income restrictions on who can access those rent control apartments. That's really where rent control becomes an issue. If I can afford to get into that rent control apartment and reduce my monthly cost, I might jump over somebody who can actually get something out of that because they have a lower income and thus would have lower rent. So that's the number one caveat to rent control, is that you'll have people who will pay basically to get in line first.
Yeah, and this, of course, is an issue that is playing out nationwide. So it's good that we're looking at it in Marin County as well. I wanted to touch on a couple things, Rob, that you mentioned. First of all, let's look at the Marin County labor force issue. You talked about jobs recovery and really us looking at this issue as, is there going to be structural change? Now, I note that in the sectors that have not recovered jobs or have had the most acute job loss, let's say, typically those are low wage sectors. You're talking about services sector, retail, restaurant, healthcare. The concern would be actually luring those workers back when they may have an increasing set of choices. So, we're looking at this question, is there going to be structural change? And you did touch on this idea as well, that business model change. And so I don't know if this is necessarily a question to you, but just something for the audience that we're trying to look into, which is, is there going to be a change? Do we have saturation of some of these types of businesses in Marin? And that is one more reason why it's not only hard to hire, but going forward, some of these jobs may not ever be replaced. We've been stubbornly at that 94, 95% level of recovery for a long time now. I don't see anything in the future that's going to suggest that is going to snap back up to 100% of recovery like we've seen in the state of California. So I wonder if you might just chew on that for a second, Rob, that jobs recovery in jobs that are low wage or maybe not desirable, is that going to be a problem for us?
Sure. Yeah, and it's not, Marin County is not alone in that issue. So one of the things that we're concerned about is with some of those jobs, those jobs tend to act as a transition play for a lot of people who may lose a job and get into something relatively easy where the requirements to get that job are relatively low. We also don't want people stuck in low to middle income jobs for a long period of time. The hope is that they come in at a young age and then use that as a catalyst to something more career long, if you want to put it that way. But I think the bigger problem, Mike, at the end of the day is how we have workforce development efforts that are trying to provide training and workers for some of those industries, and those industries slowly peeling back from using them. If we have people in Marin County or even in the region that would qualify for those jobs and want those jobs, if they're not there, do they leave the area? And how does that change or continue to change in our communities to become an older, more stagnant economy because we don't have as many people available for work, and thus we just don't have as much, generally speaking, entrepreneurial vibrancy. We don't believe we're going to be able to get the workers to fulfill new businesses, and thus it can lead to some weird stagnation that we're really trying to avoid. That's the critical factor about not having those workers available, and ultimately having those low wage jobs slowly contract over time. They can be good in the sense of having that transition piece. The critical factor is what's that lead to in terms of balance in our economy and our ability to move forward at a quicker pace.
Well, this is something we're going to have to really keep a close eye on. I think it's being understated. But that's a great segue to what we wanted to use the remaining minutes left. And I do note a number of questions in the chat. We will try to answer those questions when we send out the recording of this video. We'll answer them in an email format. Sorry, we don't have the time to get to all of those today, but we do appreciate your questions. I wanted to use the last few minutes to talk about a really exciting event that occurred last week. Some of you are probably aware that the Marin County Board of Supervisors unanimously adopted the Marin County Economic Vitality Strategic Plan, which was prepared by MEF. This is the first ever economic strategy that the County of Marin has ever adopted. And so it's really significant in the sense that we are now going to have a little bit more intentional focus on our economy and how it delivers for our residents. And so I just wanted to summarize it today. But again, you'll have a copy of this included in our email later this afternoon with a recording of this, because this is now a public document. Really what it is the first ever county level economic strategy. As some of you may know, Marin County does not have a publicly funded economic development agency. We're the only county in the Bay Area alongside Napa County that does not have that. And so we've never really had an economic strategy of which to organize our efforts around thoughtful economic development. Now we do. And this document really sets a vision for where the economy can go over the next 3 to 5 years. It includes a set of what we call flagship initiatives and activities that the county and community partners can pursue collaboratively, really leading to some of the more important outcomes that we're after. And just to summarize what those are really quick, Rob, if you can go to the next slide. These flagship initiatives, really, there are 5 of them, and they really focus on areas that we have observed and stakeholders have informed us are really critical towards the success of Marin's economy. So we've talked a lot about workforce. We know that's an issue. You know, Marin County has a lot of good workforce practitioners. They're just not really well linked. And we've got a new set of industries that are going to be growing in the next few years that currently do not have established talent pipelines. So we're going to need to have a better focus on workforce development in the next 3 to 5 years, which is, in the last discussion we had, likely going to lead to more high wage jobs. And our job is going to be to get our residents the skill sets to obtain those jobs. We're also looking at entrepreneurs. You know, in 2021 and 2020, there have been more business license applications in Marin County than ever before, in surpassing pre-pandemic levels. Rob talked about sole proprietors. There is no shortage of entrepreneurs in Marin, but they don't really have an organized ecosystem. So we're going to be pushing along those lines in the next few years. We have a green D in our DNA here in Marin County, and we have a lot of new businesses coming on stream. We have also a lot of new regulations looking at greening some of our industries and housing. And how are we going to deal with that over the next few years is going to be a critical issue with a lot of opportunity. And then Marin County, as some of you know, has some of the greatest income inequality across the nation. We have sort of the highest, unfortunately, highest ranking racial disparity. These are issues that can be addressed through providing and focusing on economic mobility for our residents. So that is a key piece of this strategy and something that's going to be really important over the next few years to make sure that all of our residents here and all of our communities have equal access to opportunities and good jobs. And then finally, what we here at MEF certainly view as a success is the opportunity for the county to formalize its economic development activities. As I said, to be a little bit more thoughtful and intentional about actually pursuing economic development that works the way that we want it to work in this county. You know, it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach to economic development. We have unique circumstances here in Marin County, but getting our county to pay attention and allocate resources towards thoughtful economic development is really a huge opportunity going forward. So Stay tuned. We will be sending the plan to you via email for those of you who registered, and feel free to share that with as many people as you can. I want to thank Rob Eiler once again for his time this morning, and I want to thank all of you for spending the morning with us. We want to let you get back to your day. So once again, I'm Mike Blakely. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next month.